In December of 2025, one of the most respected plasma physicists in America was shot dead in the doorway of his own apartment building. 10 weeks later, a retired Air Force general, the man who once commanded the military's most secret research laboratory, walked out of his New Mexico home and was never seen again. And before the spring was over, a single anonymous post on Reddit had the FBI, the United States Congress, and the White House itself all asking the same impossible question out loud. Is somebody hunting American scientists? If you watched our last investigation, you already know the old pattern. 10 scientists, 10 files, 70 years of accidents and suicides and verdicts that never quite fit the bodies. But everything in that story was history. Cold cases, yellowed files, dead men's secrets. This story is different because this one is not history at all. It happened just now, across a single winter and spring, in real time, on your phone, on the evening news, in the briefing room of the White House. This is the story of the strangest 100 days in the modern history of American science, the 100 days when a conspiracy theory stopped being a conspiracy theory and became a federal investigation. And by the end of it, you are going to have to decide which of two things you watched happen. A cover-up, breaking apart in public for the very first time. Or the moment we all learned how easily the most powerful country on earth can be made to chase a ghost. It began with a gunshot in Brookline, Massachusetts. On the night of December 15, 2025, Nuno Loureiro stepped into the foyer of his own apartment building and never made it upstairs. He was 47 years old, a professor at MIT, and not just any professor. He was the director of MIT's Plasma Science and Fusion Center, one of the leading minds on Earth in the physics of fusion, the holy grail of energy, the science of bottling a star. Someone was waiting for him in that doorway with a gun. He died the next day, and here is the detail that made the entire country's blood run cold. 2 days earlier, a gunman had walked onto the campus of Brown University and shot 2 students dead. The police would conclude it was the same man. A former student with an old academic grudge, connecting the 2 scenes, hunting people from his past. By the cold logic of the case file, the murder of Nuno Loureiro was solved. But the headline that traveled wasn't the grudge. The headline was simpler and far more frightening. The man trying to give the world unlimited energy was shot dead in his own doorway. 2 months later, it happened again. Grillmair had spent his career at Caltech staring into the deepest parts of the sky, hunting streams of ancient stars and planets around other suns. He was 67, retired, living quietly in the high desert town of Llano, California. On February 16, 2026, he was shot dead outside his own home. The police called it a carjacking. They arrested a suspect, a repeat criminal, a senseless act of violence with no meaning behind it at all. Another file, technically closed, but now there were two physicists, 2 months, both shot. And somewhere out there in the dark of the internet, somebody was about to connect the dots. On February 19, 2026, 3 days after Grillmair died, an anonymous user posted on Reddit's conspiracy forum. The post simply laid the 2 dead scientists side by side and asked the question the police never would. What if these are connected? On any other week, that post would have sunk to the bottom of the internet and died there, the way 10,000 posts like it do every single day. But then, 8 days later, something happened that no skeptic has ever fully been able to explain away. The general disappeared. William McCasland was not a man who should be able to vanish. A retired 2-star Air Force Major General. The former commander of the Air Force Research Laboratory, the empire of classified science we told you about last time, the laboratories behind the barbed wire. A man whose entire career had lived at the exact intersection of secrecy and science, who in retirement had even quietly consulted on the government's UFO files. On February 27, 2026, he left his home in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he was gone. No body, no note, no answers. As I am telling you this, months later, he has still never been found. And that was the spark in the powder. Because once the internet went looking, it found that the general and the 2 murdered physicists were not alone. The searchers dug backward through 2 years of local news, and the names started stacking up like cordwood. A materials engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a director, a woman named Reza, who walked onto a mountain trail in the Angels National Forest in June of 2025 and simply never walked off it. Never found. a JPL researcher named Frank Maywold, dead in the summer of 2024, whose cause of death was never released at all. A worker from Los Alamos, Melissa Casias, who vanished from a New Mexico highway leaving her purse, her ID, and her phones behind, one of them reportedly wiped back to factory settings. A custodian with security access at the plant that builds components for America's nuclear weapons, who walked out of his house one August evening and disappeared. A retired foreman who spent his life building at Los Alamos. Gone. A 29-year-old NASA engineer, dead in a crash. A cancer researcher at Novides who went missing in December and was pulled out of a frozen Massachusetts lake 3 months later. One by one, the names were lifted out of small local newspapers and laid side by side on one list. And on a list, they stopped looking like tragedies. They started looking like a pattern. You already know what happened next because you watched it. The list jumped from Reddit to YouTube, from YouTube to the tabloids, from the tabloids to cable news. By April, it was everywhere. A clip of a young anti-gravity researcher named Amy Eskridge, talking about suppressed energy technology before her own death years earlier, exploded to 2.5 million views on TikTok in 3 days. Joe Rogan talked about it to the biggest audience in podcasting. And then it crossed the line that conspiracy theories almost never cross. It walked into the United States government. A sitting congresswoman posted that there were now 11 missing or dead or suicided scientists, all linked to space or military programs. The chairman of the House Oversight Committee sent letters demanding briefings from the director of the FBI and the Secretary of Defense. And then, from the podium of the White House itself, the press secretary announced that the administration was, quote, actively working with all relevant agencies and the FBI to holistically review all of the cases. The President of the United States called it pretty serious stuff. The director of the FBI went further. If there are any connections that lead to nefarious conduct or conspiracy, he said, this FBI will make the appropriate arrest. Stop and feel the weight of that for a moment. 60 days earlier, this was one anonymous post on a conspiracy forum. Now the most powerful law enforcement agency on the planet was publicly hunting for the connection. So, did they find one? Here is where this story splits in two, and you are going to have to choose which half you believe. Because at the end of April, the FBI quietly announced its first finding. The murder of Nuno Loureiro, the MIT fusion physicist, the case that started it all, had no nexus to anything larger. A solved killing by a known gunman with a personal grudge. And once the fact-checkers and the statisticians took the famous list apart, name by name, it began to crumble in their hands. The 11 scientists were not 11, and they were not all scientists. The list included a custodian, an administrative assistant, a retired construction foreman, a researcher who had died of Alzheimer's, a young man killed in an ordinary traffic collision. The cancer researcher pulled from the lake had been struggling with depression, and it was his own widow who said so, begging the internet to stop. The 2 shootings were both solved, with both killers caught, and nothing connecting them to anything. And then came the coldest number of all. Roughly 700,000 Americans hold security clearances in aerospace and nuclear work. In any normal stretch of time, in a population that size, statisticians calculated you would expect around 250 deaths just like these. Not 11, 250. The pattern, the experts said, was never out there in the world. It was in us. The human brain is a machine for finding patterns, and it does not come with an off switch. The widow of Carl Grillmair, the murdered astronomer, gave the theory 2 words: absolute nonsense. The brother of another man on the list called it baloney, Loch Ness monster, Bigfoot stuff, while strangers online turned his dead brother into content. One journalist summed up the whole spring in a single sentence: this is family trauma, being monetized for clicks. And if the story ended there, it would be a clean little fable about the internet fooling itself. But it does not quite end there, because some of it is still true and still open right now. General McCasland is still missing. A man who commanded the Air Force's most classified research has been gone for months, and no one can tell you where he is or why. Melissa Casias was eventually found, deep in a national forest, in an area searchers say they had already combed, with a handgun lying nearby, and as of this recording, the medical examiner has still not ruled on how she died. Her family says they are still pursuing answers. And Frank Maywold's cause of death has never been made public at all. Last time, we told you about Frank Olson, the government scientist whose suicide turned out 20 years later, to be a CIA lie. So no one can tell you that governments never bury the truth about their dead scientists. We know they have. But Frank Olson's truth came out through 20 years of documents, autopsies, and sworn testimony. This time, the verdict was rendered in 60 days by an algorithm before a single investigation had finished. So now it comes down to you, just like last time. 11 names on a list. A solved grudge, a solved carjacking, a drowning, a crash, an illness, and a handful of cases that are simply, honestly, still open. Drop a red circle in the comments if you believe that where there is this much smoke, somewhere under it there is fire, and the right list, the real list, just hasn't been written yet. Or drop a white circle if you believe we all just watched a ghost story write itself in real time, and the scariest thing in this entire video is how fast it reached the White House. And before you scroll away, sit with one last question for a moment, because it is the only one that actually matters. Which frightens you more? That someone could make 11 people disappear and bury it. Or that no one did, that nothing connected any of it, and a single anonymous post still steered the eyes of an entire nation, its news, its Congress, its FBI for 100 days? Because one of those two things definitely happened. And we still do not know which.